It breaks my heart how these poor children were born into that whole mess. That comment sat there on the screen. 96 people agreed with it. 96 strangers who'd never met each other, who probably live in different countries, who speak different languages, and every single one of them felt the same thing watching these children's stories. Heartbreak. But here's the thing. That feeling you had, it wasn't just sadness. It was a verdict. You looked at what happened to these children and your gut told you something that took geneticists until 2009 to prove with numbers. This wasn't misfortune. This wasn't bad luck. This was something that was done to them. Deliberately. Repeatedly. For 200 years. By adults who could see exactly what was happening and chose to keep going. So today, we're not doing a history lesson. We're building a case, exhibit by exhibit, name by name. And you're the jury. Let's start with the evidence. Picture a family tree. You've seen them before. Branches spreading outward, generation after generation, the way a tree is supposed to grow. Now picture one where the branches don't spread. They loop. They curl back on themselves. They connect to the same trunk over and over until what you're looking at isn't a tree anymore. It's a knot. In April 2009, a team of geneticists at the University of Santiago de Compostela, Gonzalo Alvarez, Francisco Ceballos, and Celsa Quintero, published a study in the journal PLOS ONE that did something no one had done before. They built a genealogical database of over 3,000 individuals across 16 generations of the Habsburg dynasty and calculated the inbreeding coefficient of every single one. That coefficient is a number between 0 and 1. 0 means your parents share no common ancestors at all. 1 means, well, 1 is impossible. The expected coefficient for a child born from a brother-sister union is 0.250. Charles II of Spain, born November 6, 1661, in the Royal Alcázar of Madrid, scored 0.254. Read that again. He was more inbred than the child of siblings. More inbred than if his own mother and father had been brother and sister. Not because any single marriage in his ancestry was that extreme, but because so many consanguineous marriages stacked on top of each other, generation after generation, that the cumulative effect exceeded what a single act of incest could produce. The loops in his family tree didn't just double back, they tripled, they quadrupled. Every path through his ancestry led back to the same small cluster of people. And the study showed it wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow, deliberate escalation. Philip I, Philip the Handsome, the man who started the Spanish Habsburg line when he married Joanna of Castile in 1496, had a coefficient of 0.025. Unremarkable. Background noise for European royalty of that era. His great-grandson, Philip II, came in at 0.123, 5 times higher. Philip III, born 1578, hit 0.218. And then Charles II at 0.254, the end of the line in every sense of the word. Of the 11 marriages in the principal Spanish Habsburg line between 1516 and 1661, 9 were consanguineous, 9 out of 11. Across the broader dynasty, 67% of all marriages, 49 out of 73, involved couples more closely related than second cousins. Nearly 40% involved couples closer than first cousins. This wasn't cultural drift. This was policy. And the dynasty had a motto they were proud of. One that said it plainly, Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Marriage was their weapon. They said so themselves. So who were the people pulling the trigger? Because abstractions don't marry each other. People do. Adults sit in rooms and make decisions about which child will marry which other child, and those decisions have names and dates attached to them. Philip II of Spain, the most powerful man in the 16th century world. He married 4 times. His 4th wife was Anna of Austria, born November 2nd, 1549, in Sagales, Castile. She was his niece, the daughter of his own sister, Maria of Spain. They married on November 14, 1570, in Segovia. He was 43, she was 20. Anna bore Philip 5 children between 1571 and 1580. 4 died in childhood. Ferdinand, gone at 6. Carlos Lorenzo barely survived his first year. Only the future Philip III made it to adulthood, and contemporaries described him as sickly, pale, and intellectually unremarkable. Anna herself died on October 26, 1580, at 30 years old, her body spent after a final childbirth. So what did Philip III do with this information? Did he look at his own sickly body, count his dead siblings, and choose differently for his own children? He married Margaret of Austria, first cousins once removed. Their son, Philip IV, managed to outdo everyone who came before him. On November 7, 1649, in Navalcarnero, near Madrid, Philip IV married Mariana of Austria, his niece, the daughter of his own sister, Maria Anna of Spain, and Emperor Ferdinand III. And here's the detail that should make your stomach turn. Mariana wasn't originally intended for Philip. She was supposed to marry Philip's son, Balthazar Charles. When Balthazar Charles died in October 1646, at 16 years old, in Zaragoza, the 12-year-old Mariana was simply redirected from the dead son to the living father, 30 years her senior, like rerouting a shipment. Mariana was 14 when the wedding took place, 14 years old, married to a 44-year-old man who was her uncle by blood, in a ceremony that required the Pope's written permission, because even the Catholic Church's own laws said this union was too close. She'd been raised in the Austrian court, knowing she would marry a Spanish prince, just not this one. Not the father. One day, you're a girl betrothed to a boy roughly your age. The next, that boy is dead, and the adults have decided you'll marry his father instead, because the territorial math hasn't changed. Only the groom has. She bore 5 children. Margaret Teresa survived to 21, long enough to be married off to her own maternal uncle, Emperor Leopold I, continuing the loop. Maria Ambrosia died as an infant. Philip Prospero, the desperately wanted male heir, died at 3. Thomas Charles died as an infant. And then came Charles II, the survivor, if you can call it that. Mariana spent Philip IV's remaining years watching her children die, one after another, while carrying the weight of a dynasty that needed her body to produce a viable male heir, a task the dynasty's own marriage strategy had made biologically almost impossible. When Philip IV died on September 17, 1665, Charles II was 3 years old and couldn't walk. Mariana became Queen Regent, governing Spain on behalf of a child everyone at court could see was profoundly damaged. She fought ferociously to maintain power, battling Don Juan José de Austria, Philip IV's illegitimate son, who sought to displace her as regent. She was eventually forced from court in 1677, exiled to Toledo by Don Juan José's faction. She returned only after his death in 1679. Think about that for a second. The one parent who stayed, who fought to keep control of Charles's regency, who spent a decade maneuvering through court politics to protect her position, was the woman who'd been traded from a dead boy to his father at 14, and who'd buried 3 of her 5 children before they could speak. Whatever fierceness Mariana showed, she showed it inside a system that had used her since childhood. She wasn't the architect. She was the building material. And she watched the consequences unfold in her son's body every single day. But a marriage between an uncle and a niece couldn't just happen. Not in Catholic Europe. Not under canon law. Which brings us to the institution that had the only mechanism in early modern Europe capable of stopping all of this, and used it instead as a rubber stamp. Since the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, convened by Pope Innocent III with over 400 bishops in attendance, the Catholic Church maintained strict prohibitions against consanguineous marriages. Unions within 4 degrees of kinship were forbidden. An uncle-niece marriage falls within the 2nd degree, so close to absolute prohibition that granting an exception was supposed to require extraordinary justification. For any such marriage to proceed, the couple needed a papal dispensation, a formal document, issued by the Pope himself or his curia, stamped with the papal seal, filed, recorded, archived, paper trail. The process was bureaucratic and specific. A petition traveled from the royal court to Rome, typically routed through the apostolic nuncio or a cardinal protector. It named the bride and groom. It specified the exact degree of consanguinity. It stated a just cause for why the prohibition should be waived. Officials in the apostolic penitentiary, or the Dietaria, reviewed the petition, assessed the gravity of the impediment, and forwarded a recommendation. The Pope signed. The seal was applied. The document was dispatched. And what was the just cause cited in Habsburg petitions? Every time, the same thing. Political consolidation, territorial unity, defense of the Catholic faith against Protestant encroachment. The dynasty's ambitions dressed up in theological language and submitted as a prayer. Think about Philip II's 4th marriage for a moment. It's 1570. The petition arrives in Rome from the Escorial, Philip's gray-walled palace monastery north of Madrid. It names Anna of Austria. It names the impediment, 2nd degree of consanguinity, uncle to niece. And it lands on the desk of Pope Pius V, a Dominican friar, a former inquisitor, a man of such severe personal piety that he'd later be canonized as a saint. Of all the popes who might have said no, Pius V was the one. He didn't say no, because Philip II wasn't just a king. He was the Church's sword arm. His armies fought Protestantism in the Netherlands. His treasury funded Catholic missions across the globe. His soldiers and his gold had been essential to the Council of Trent. Denying Philip a marriage that would bind the Spanish and Austrian branches of the dynasty, strengthening the Catholic world's most important military power, wasn't something any pope dependent on Spanish protection could afford to do. The dispensation was granted, the seal was affixed, the marriage went forward, and the genetic noose tightened by another generation. Here's what makes the Church's complicity so damning. They weren't ignorant. Their own intellectual tradition recognized exactly what these marriages risked. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the Summa Theologica in the 1260s and 1270s, argued explicitly that consanguineous marriages were contrary to natural law in part because they produced, his Latin phrase, proles deficiens, deficient offspring. He grounded this not just in theology, but in observable evidence. St. Augustine, centuries before the Habsburg marriage machine hit its peak, wrote in The City of God that the prohibition on close-kin marriage was confirmed by experience. The Church's own saints told them this would happen. When Philip IV's dispensation request arrived in 1649, another uncle, another niece, it landed before Pope Innocent X, a pontiff who'd actively clashed with Spain over Italian influence and raged over the Peace of Westphalia's concessions to Protestantism. He had every reason to refuse. He didn't. Same calculus, same dependency, same signature, same seal. And within 12 years, 5 children born, 3 dead, and Charles II. The fees for these dispensations scaled with the wealth of the petitioner and the severity of the impediment. For a dynasty as rich as the Habsburgs, the cost was a rounding error in an imperial budget, a small price for a continent. Now meet the child who paid the actual price. The Alvarez study found that infant and child mortality among the Spanish Habsburgs reached 50%. 1 in 2. Half of all children born to this dynasty didn't make it to their 10th birthday. In an era when aristocratic families with access to the best physicians, the best nutrition, the warmest palaces in Europe saw mortality rates of 20 to 30%, the Habsburgs were dying at nearly double that rate. And the study demonstrated a direct, statistically significant correlation. As the inbreeding coefficient rose generation by generation, so did child death. These weren't plague victims. These weren't casualties of war or famine. These were children whose genomes had been so thoroughly folded upon themselves that the biological redundancy meant to protect them, the genetic insurance policy that evolution spent millions of years building, had been systematically stripped away. Charles II is the name everyone knows, but before we get to him, think about the ones who don't even get names in the history books. Philip II and Anna of Austria's children, 4 out of 5, gone. Philip IV and Mariana's, 3 out of 5, gone before they could walk. Philip Prospero, the golden boy, the heir Spain spent years praying for, dead at 3 years old. Each one a data point in a pattern that the adults arranging these marriages could see with their own eyes, decade after decade, and chose to ignore. A 2019 study in the Annals of Human Biology, led by Roman Vilas and colleagues, again from the University of Santiago de Compostela, had maxillofacial surgeons assess portraits of 15 Habsburg family members spanning 5 centuries. They track the progression of mandibular prognathism and maxillary deficiency using standardized clinical criteria. Generation by generation, the jaw worsened. Generation by generation, the face became more distorted. It's there in the paintings. The artists weren't hiding it. They couldn't. And then there was Charles, born November 6, 1661. He couldn't walk until he was 4 years old. He couldn't chew solid food until he was 8. His jaw so malformed by the mandibular prognathism that had been worsening across 9 successive generations that basic human functions were beyond him. He suffered seizures. Contemporaries described him as short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before the age of 35. He was almost certainly infertile. 2 marriages produced no children, and his autopsy reportedly revealed a body so internally devastated that the physicians who examined him were shocked he'd lived as long as he did. But here's the final cruelty the system inflicted on him. Rather than acknowledge what 2 centuries of deliberate inbreeding had done, rather than look at the family tree and draw the obvious conclusion, the Spanish court decided Charles was bewitched, cursed, hechizado. El hechizado, they called him, the bewitched, as if dark magic, not their own marriage contracts, had broken this boy's body. And they didn't just whisper about it, they brought in the professionals. Fray Froilán Diaz, Charles's royal confessor, became the driving force behind a formal campaign of exorcism in the final years of the king's life. In 1698, the Inquisitor General Baltasar de Mendoza y Sandoval authorized the proceedings, giving them the full institutional weight of the Spanish Inquisition itself. Friars were dispatched, not just to pray, to interrogate. The theory, and they pursued this with deadly seriousness, was that Charles had been cursed through a cup of chocolate given to him when he was 14 years old, laced with a spell designed to destroy his ability to produce an heir. That was the official working hypothesis. Not 2 centuries of uncle-niece marriages, not a family tree with more loops than branches, not an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. A cup of hot chocolate. The exorcists claimed they'd located the specific demons responsible. According to testimony extracted from a nun in the town of Cangas de Tineo, a woman named Sor Maria, who supposedly channeled the voices of the demons inhabiting Charles, the bewitchment had been designed to attack specific organs. One demon was assigned to destroy his capacity for generation, another to attack his kidneys, another his stomach. The possessed nun relayed these details in sessions that court officials documented and filed. Written records of demon assignments for a genetic condition. Charles himself submitted to the exorcism rites. Picture it. The most powerful monarch in the Western world, King of Spain and its global empire, sitting in his royal chambers while Capuchin friars recited prayers of deliverance over his trembling body. His oversized jaw, his swollen tongue so large it made his speech nearly unintelligible, his legs too weak to carry him reliably, and around him, grown men, educated men, men of the church, men of the Inquisition, solemnly casting out devils from a body that had been broken not by Satan, but by papal dispensations and marriage contracts negotiated in oak-paneled rooms decades before he was born. The exorcism affair eventually spiraled into a political scandal. Fray Froilan Diaz was arrested by the Inquisition itself in 1700 on charges of having abused the exorcism process for political gain. Factions at court used the whole debacle to settle scores. Accusation and counter-accusation flew, and through it all, Charles sat at the center, the child around whom the adults continued their power games, even as his body failed. They couldn't cure him. They couldn't explain him. So they exorcised him, investigated the exorcists, arrested the confessor who ordered the exorcism, and filed paperwork about all of it. They did everything except look at the family tree hanging on the wall and admit what it showed. He died on November 1st, 1700, 5 days before his 39th birthday, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. And then came the bill. Charles died without an heir. How could he produce one? And his will named Philip, Duke of Anjou, the grandson of France's Louis XIV, as his successor. The Austrian Habsburgs, who'd spent 2 centuries intermarrying with the Spanish branch to keep the combined empire in family hands, were not about to accept a French Bourbon on the Spanish throne. Neither was England. Neither were the Dutch. Neither was the Holy Roman Empire. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted in 1701, and it wasn't a border skirmish. It was a continental catastrophe. On August 13, 1704, at the small Bavarian village of Blenheim on the Danube, an Allied army under the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy smashed a Franco-Bavarian force and killed or captured over 30,000 soldiers in a single afternoon. It was one of the bloodiest days in 18th century warfare, and it happened because a boy in Madrid couldn't father a child. On May 23, 1706, at Ramillies in the Spanish Netherlands, Marlborough crushed a French army again, seizing virtually all of what is now Belgium in the battle's aftermath. At Malplaquet, on September 11, 1709, the two sides collided in a fight so savage that the Allies technically won, but suffered over 20,000 casualties doing it, more than the victorious side usually absorbed in an entire campaign. The war sprawled across Flanders, Bavaria, northern Italy, Spain itself, the Atlantic, the Caribbean. Barcelona was besieged. Gibraltar was stormed by Anglo-Dutch Marines on August 4, 1704, and it never came back. It's still British today, 320 years later, a small rocky peninsula at the bottom of Spain that exists as a British territory because a Habsburg boy's body gave out. Minorca fell in 1708. Naples changed hands. Milan changed hands. Sardinia changed hands. By the time the Treaty of Utrecht was signed on April 11, 1713, and the Supplementary Treaty of Rastatt in 1714, the map of Europe had been redrawn. Spain lost the Spanish Netherlands, gone to Austria. Naples and Sardinia, gone to Austria. Sicily, gone to Savoy. Gibraltar and Minorca, gone to Britain. The Spanish Empire, which had been the greatest power on earth when Philip II married his niece in 1570, emerged from the war a second-rate power, stripped of its European possessions, its military reputation shattered, its treasury hollowed out. Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain, kept the throne but ruled a diminished kingdom. The price of installing him? Conservatively, several 100,000 dead across 13 years of fighting. 200 years of uncle-niece marriages, of papal dispensations, of dead infants and malformed heirs. And the final consequence wasn't just a broken boy on a throne. It was a continental war. The system's last victim wasn't Charles II. It was Europe itself. And here's where someone always says, "But that was centuries ago. They didn't understand genetics. You can't judge them by modern standards." Can't you? In Strasburg, Pennsylvania, there's a place called the Clinic for Special Children. It was founded by Dr. Holmes Morton, a pediatrician who arrived in Lancaster County and discovered something that the local medical establishment had been quietly living with for decades. Amish children were dying of diseases that almost no one else got. Maple syrup urine disease, Ellis Van Creveld syndrome, a condition causing short-limbed dwarfism and heart defects. Luteric aciduria type 1, Crigler-Najjar syndrome, diseases so rare in the general population that most doctors never see a single case in their entire career, occurring in Amish communities at rates that dwarfed anything in the outside world. The reason is the same mechanism, exactly the same. The Amish population in North America descends from roughly 200 founders who emigrated from Europe in the 18th century. 200 people. That's the entire genetic base. And because Amish communities marry within their faith, generation after generation, drawing from that same limited pool, the founder effect concentrates recessive mutations the same way the Habsburg marriage strategy did. Different century, different continent, different intent entirely. Same genetics, same suffering children. Nobody planned this in the Amish community. There's no emperor arranging uncle-niece marriages for territorial gain. The intent couldn't be more different. These are communities built on faith, humility, and mutual care, not imperial ambition. But the mechanism doesn't care about intent. It cares about math. And the math says, when you restrict a breeding population, recessive disorders surface. Every time, without exception. Dr. Morton's clinic exists because the science is undeniable, and some Amish families have begun working with genetic counselors to understand the risks, an act of courage within a tradition that prizes insularity. The Habsburgs had no such excuse for ignorance. They had 3,000 years of cultural wisdom and the Catholic Church's own theological tradition telling them close kin marriage harmed offspring. They had Thomas Aquinas spelling it out in Latin. They had their own dead children telling them this, baby after baby, generation after generation, the mortality rate climbing in lockstep with the inbreeding coefficient. They watched the evidence pile up for 200 years, and they kept signing the marriage contracts. The church kept stamping the dispensations. The advisors kept negotiating the betrothals. Everyone kept collecting their piece of the arrangement. Territory, military alliance, papal fees, political stability. and the children kept paying. That's not ignorance, that's a choice. A cold, calculated, repeated choice made by adults with power at the expense of children with none. 11 marriages in the Spanish line, 9 consanguineous, a 50% child mortality rate, a boy who couldn't chew food until he was 8, who was exorcised for demons that lived in his kidneys, whose death without an heir triggered a 13-year war that reshaped the Western world. A church that stamped every dispensation, collected every fee, and cited its own political dependency as just cause. A motto, their own motto, the one they were proud of, that admitted the whole thing. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Marriage was their weapon, children were their ammunition, and the church sold them the gunpowder. So let's end where we should end. Not with the system, not with the church, not with the politics or the war. With the children. Ferdinand, son of Philip II and Anna of Austria, dead at 6. Carlos Lorenzo, their son, dead before his first birthday. Philip Prospero, son of Philip IV and Mariana, the heir Spain spent years praying for, dead at 3. Maria Ambrosia, his sister, dead in infancy. Thomas Charles, his brother, dead in infancy. 3 names, if they were even given names, not recorded in the histories that obsess over succession and territory. And Charles, born November 6, 1661, dead November 1st, 1700. 38 years of a life that was never really his, a body engineered by committee, a boy who couldn't walk, couldn't eat, couldn't produce the one thing his entire existence was designed to produce, an heir. Because the system that created him had finally, irreversibly, consumed itself. A king who spent his last years being prayed over by exorcists, blamed by a court that invented demons rather than face the truth written in its own archives. It breaks my heart. Yeah, it should. Because for 200 years, these children needed someone to grieve for them. The adults in their lives wouldn't do it. They were too busy negotiating the next marriage contract, petitioning Rome for the next dispensation, calculating the next territorial gain. The church wouldn't do it. The fees were paid, the seals were stamped, the theology was conveniently flexible. The court physicians recorded the symptoms, called in the exorcists, blamed a cup of chocolate, and moved on. So if your heart broke watching this, that wasn't just a feeling. That was judgment, and it came 400 years late. But these children deserved it anyway. Subscribe for more stories like this.